Thank you very much, Don. Yes. So I would like to start off with asking the question that what should the board and officers know of procurement fraud? They are not expected to have expert knowledge of fraud. However, they are expected to have a reasonable understanding of what can likely lead to procurement fraud and wrongdoing in the organization. So they must first have that appreciation. They are also expected to know what to do to prevent a fraudulent culture, and also how to act when fraud is suspected within the organization. So not being a fraud expert, that does not mean to say that you are going to rely on other parties to guide you through that process. It means to say that you have to be able to understand what fraud looks like in your organization. The procurement legislation for Trinidad and Tobago, as Kamala said before, although not yet entirely proclaimed, it is anticipated that sometime in the near future, it will be fully proclaimed. And we would anticipate that not only public organizations, but private organizations will use the legislation, not because it is enforced upon them to do so, but also because it is best practice. It is the right thing to do. And this is what you want of boards and officers of company, for them to understand what is the right thing to do. So although it is not proclaimed, it does include integrity in procurement as one of its objects. So we need to understand that we need to stop having dishonesty and illegalities in our procurement process. It really leads to billions of dollars of losses. The Act also speaks specifically to bid rigging. So I was always amazed that, it spent its time to give you a definition of bid rigging, which means collusion between persons for the purpose of manipulating the procurement proceedings. And it's amazing how easily it is to manipulate that process. So the involvement or participation in bid rigging, fraudulent alteration of procurement documents, something as simple as that, or any action that is deemed as directly or indirectly influencing the procurement proceedings in order to obtain an unfair advantage, be it for you, the person who is acting illegally or fraudulently, or someone who is benefiting from it. This can lead to severe financial penalties and imprisonment. And I don't think sometimes directors understand that the fact is, if it is you're seeing a legislation that is saying financial penalties, the company might be able to pay that for you. But if it is also saying and imprisonment, it means to say somebody has to make jail. So you have to determine whether it is you as a director, you as the officer, or who in the organization will be making that jail. Yes, so companies don't make jail, persons do. So it's a matter of who will be imprisoned. So board directors and officers should therefore take action to ensure that persons within the procurement proceedings do not act with intent to create an advantage or concession for himself or any other person. Because sometimes you're not seeing that the person within the organization directly benefiting, but there is somebody on the outside who is benefiting. Yeah, so it's always somebody being, or whichever organization being disadvantaged, be the company, the supplier, the contractor. But because of that disadvantagement, it means somebody somewhere in that process is benefiting. And I believe that is one thing that everybody must be quite clear about, that fraud allows someone somewhere to benefit. And that is why it pays them to be fraudulent. So the board must be continuously mindful of the conduct influencing such persons, their relationships with suppliers and contractors, especially where there are indicators of beneficial interest. So sometimes the person may have more than, let's say, 20% shareholdings. And even if it is less than 20% shareholdings, you need to look at it also from that perspective. You must know what are the shares being held by the persons within that procurement process. Yeah, any business associates, any related parties such as spouse or children who may be involved in the supplier or the contractor's entity or in your own entity that can benefit from that procurement process. Declarations of conflict of interest must be enforced. So you want to make sure that everyone, the officers, the directors, anyone within that procurement process must declare conflict of interest. And the board should prohibit and ensure the directors and officers and employees do not accept or offer gratuities, gifts, inducements to influence the outcome of the procurement process. So oftentimes you would find organizations, they embrace gifts, they embrace certain type of benefits, and they simply believe that it does not act as an inducement within that procurement process. But every gift or gratuity or whatever it may be ought to be reported. So your policy ought to be specific as to how the reporting or recording of gifts and gratuities, etc., should be treated. Any confidentiality also must be upheld, because if it is confidentiality is not being upheld, it means to say that information, critical information pertaining to one contractor or a supplier's bid can be shared with another competitor. Yes, and it can also fraudulently impact that process. So any discussions, communications, negotiations, or dialogue between the company and the supplier or contractor must be treated as highly confidential. The invitation to bid documents can also state these requirements. So even before bids are received, within that package, it should stipulate that the company has zero tolerance for lack of or breach of confidentiality. The use of non-disclosure agreements can be enforced, especially during the bidding process and the tender evaluation process. All organizations should have a standard form of confidentiality agreement and non-disclosure agreements that can be easily used. The Act prohibits victimization against persons acting in good faith on the basis of reasonable belief. So it means to see that these individuals, once it is that they're acting in good faith, can report to the regulator any incidents or perceived incidents of bid rigging or other forms of collusion, or any irregularity in procurement proceedings on the breach of the Act. However, it also addresses persons who knowingly and mischievously makes or causes to be made false reports or statements, or make frivolous or vexatious requests for investigations of the entities, its officers or directors. Because once it is that there is any investigation or any probe of the directors, the officers, or the company, it really and truly impacts the professional reputation of the individuals, and it also impacts the reputation of the organization. So those types of frivolous or vexatious or mischievous types of reporting should be frowned upon by the organization, and within the internal policies, it should also be made clear that the organization will take disciplinary action if such types of reports are being made. The board must also ensure its officers and employees provide truthful information to the procurement regulators or any investigators, because it could be the integrity of commission also, the integrity commission also. And they should not withhold, conceal, destroy, or refuse to provide company records and documents. Because just the mere fact that you're destroying documents, that says something. It means to say that there's a lack of integrity in your process, there's a lack of disclosure and transparency. So even so, it might not lend itself to fraudulent behavior, but at the same time, it's a lack of transparency, which the Act also frowns upon. Lastly, the board should be prepared to act when they have reasonable grounds to believe that the procurement process is being compromised fraudulently or illegally. So they can reject abnormally low bid submissions, So they can do that. If it is that they believe that the parties outside there, they are manipulating their bids so that the lowest one will or is most likely to be successful. They can cancel the procurement process, right? So once it is that they believe that something is going wrong, they can cancel that procurement process and restart. They can instruct the investigation of the process, yes? But doing nothing is not an option for the board. So they cannot state that they don't know the legislation, that they don't know what fraud looks like, yes, and that they are not fraud experts. The fact here is they must have reasonable knowledge and understanding of what procurement fraud looks like. Thank you.
Excellent. That's a very good start to the conversation, all right? And I expect that lots of thoughts have been raised both in our panelists and in our persons who are attending. All right, so I will go right into introduce Mr. Ram. I see that he has extensive knowledge and experience in the fields of accountancy, as a secretary and attorney, and he also the university lecturer. I even took a little peek at some of his websites and so on, and I'm seeing they're very strident. He makes some very strident noises about how the Guyanese area should invest in the oil and to make sure that they are giving their fair share, all right, in terms of this of the new energy boom. All right, so I know that he's a strong advocate, all right, in this area. I will look forward to his presentation now also.
Good afternoon, and thank you, everyone. Thank you again for the opportunity, Kamala, for participating in this discussion. In some ways, there's little contribution I can make to this afternoon's discussion, because we do not, in Guyana, or maybe I should start on a positive note. Guyana has constitutionalized the question of procurement. The Procurement Commission is a constitutional body. Of course, you know, that's on paper, how it operates. We currently don't have a Procurement Commission because the persons, although they've been sworn in, they've been identified, they've not been sworn in. But procurement in Guyana as a topical issue relates only to public entities. We have no law or perhaps even practice relating to procurement in private entities. I am not aware, and I do, as auditor, you do have access to certain records. I'm not aware, and you know, the accounts of public entities are published under the laws of Guyana. And it's striking that whilst procurement is probably the main source of expenditure, particularly if one leaves out wages and salaries, procurement must be the next most significant item of expenditure. I am not aware of a single company in Guyana that has a procurement committee. We have audit committees, which is probably the closest you will get. But again, it depends on the terms of reference. Procurement is often a matter, and I suggested yesterday, directors, officers in practice are more powerful than directors in practice, because they're the ones who generally drive procurement in the entity. Because we don't have any law, any procurement offense, bid rigging, is a matter of criminal law. And we all know how difficult it is to convict in criminal law, especially when the act or the practice is done in a very cloistered environment of a boardroom or the management committee room, call it what you will. So we have never, ever heard of a procurement conviction in a private entity in Guyana. There might be plenty anecdotes. You hear persons might have, oh, you know, they've got this contact and that contact. But that's it. Other than the anecdotes, you don't have the question of procurement. As far as company law is concerned, in terms of procurement, or as the Companies Act describes it, material contracts, all that is required is disclosure and the avoidance of conflict. So you should disclose any particular case of a contract in which one has, or a material contract in which one has an interest. And you know what is a material contract? It becomes itself a matter of some dispute. I'm sorry. Sorry about that. Yes, it's a matter of dispute. Worse yet, and I'm not sure how the Caribbean legislation operates, but in our case, it mainly has to do with the director himself. Interestingly enough, it doesn't cover officers, and they're the ones who very often, most often, are the ones who get involved in contracts. So even to the extent that the Companies Act makes provision for non-conflict, the legislation, and I'm not sure how other Companies Act in the region might be affected, does not deal with the critical issues of procurement per se. It would seem to me that it's the most logical thing, and it's the most necessary thing, that just like you should have a procurement committee within the entity, and if it gets too big, it goes to the National Procurement and Administration Board. In private entities, there ought to be similar kind of control. Our moderator referred to the oil and gas. Now, and this is common with international entities. You have an international entity. They have international buying arrangements. So the Guyana entity, and whether we are talking about oil companies or you're talking about any other type of business that operates within an international framework, meaning it has locations in different jurisdictions, they logically and quite sensibly have provision for centralized procurement, because in that case, you can buy at very marked discounts. So what happens then is a local entity has very little say. Take in our case, our oil companies. Nobody can tell Esso or Hess or CNOOC Nexen or Repsol, look, this is how you will procure. These are the rules. Yes, we have local content legislation. And that perhaps is something of a control, but that deals with the residence of the person with whom you're contracting, because a Guyanese anywhere is considered local content for purposes of our legislation, which creates its own problems because they're not subject to the jurisdiction of Guyana. So how can we fix this? I think that in the case of public companies, at least, then the audit committee ought to take, or any specialized committee ought to take procurement on board. I think the accounting profession needs to consider when it's auditing purchases, whether it's goods, whether it's services, whether it's goods of a capital nature or of a current nature, ought to look at whether or not there is a functioning oversight committee that addresses procurement, because otherwise you could get very inflated costs and the financial statements could be heavily distorted, more than they are with these international groups of companies and so on. If the auditor, who is the only person perhaps who has a right to peek into the books and into the transactions of the entity, and therefore, in my view, the auditor ought to be looking into this. But the auditor looks into its procurement policies of the company. There is none. You include that in your management letter as an observation, and the directors or the management, often the responses to the management letter come from management, say, look, we have considered your request, but we feel that the existing system is in the best interest of the company. And what do you then do? You have absolutely no recourse or alternative. Again, I come back. Should this be incorporated in corporate governance rules? Should it be part of the stock exchange rules, etc.? And I must say, my discussions today are limited to the practices, to the law and practices in Guyana. And it is not a situation of which I, as a Guyanese accountant, auditor, lawyer, or anything like that, commentator, can be very proud. That would be my contribution.
Great, thank you for giving us that perspective, right? And see there's opportunity there for improvements in the governance practices there within Guyana, all right? And maybe we can go into some more depth again when we have the conversations. I will now introduce Mr. John Dowse, who was just indicated that he spent 11 years in Trinidad in his fields, and he seems to have a wide range of expertise in both law and especially construction areas and construction procurement and delivery. And he said the period of 2008 coming upwards, he was in Trinidad, right? And he practices right now in Canada, all right? And he provides expertise worldwide now. And so he can share with us some of the experiences in the presentation now, in the direction in terms of procurement fraud and big rigging.
Certainly, and thank you, Don, for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you to Kamla and the Institute for this opportunity. I today would like to take a slightly different approach to those of my co-panelists. And I would like to look at the human aspect of procurement fraud, that is how it affects us as individuals and as a society, how and where procurement fraud and bid rigging is seen to occur, the effect it has. It's often said to be a victimless crime, but that's a wholly inaccurate description. It's a crime which affects every one of us indirectly. And there are categories of victims. There are primary victims, but most of us are secondary victims. That is, we feel the aftershock of this crime. We feel it further down the line from the time at which the crime is perpetrated. I'd also like to look at the red flags, signs which forewarn of the opportunity for the crime, and the markers because those markers often can be used as a guide to what needs to change in order to limit this crime. I'd like to revisit the definition that was given not long ago as well. What is procurement fraud? It's a deliberate deception intended to influence any stage of the procure to pay life cycle in order to make a financial gain. Bid rigging is a manipulation of the process to ensure that the desired advantage is gained in the procurement process. Now, procurement fraud generally occurs in two phases, either before the contract is awarded or during the lifetime of the project, for example. By its nature, bid rigging occurs earlier rather than later. It's intended to influence the lead up to signing a binding contract. As has been said, a company of itself does not commit a crime, even though a company is a legal entity. But the crime is committed by individuals or groups of individuals, some of which may be officers of the company, some of whom might simply be other employees who are coerced into taking certain action. Sadly, the practice is widespread. We're not just talking about it being in the Caribbean, it's global. It affects developed countries and it affects developing countries. It has been shown that strict legislation in some jurisdictions have worked to combat the crime, although I can't say that it's completely removed it. In some countries, we see better results than in others. Some countries still need to start to address the problem, but everywhere needs to continue to address the problem, no matter what the framework they have in place at the moment. Now, not only is the crime seen in, for example, the procurement of government projects, and there is a considerable expenditure across all nations in infrastructure, in public buildings, public housing and the like, but it's identified in many diverse areas. And two I would just like to give you as examples are, it's seen in space exploration. NASA has actually found evidence of bid rigging to provide substandard parts for some of its space exploration emissions. It's also been seen recently in the food industry. You might remember the issue of plastic rice, where rice was being contaminated with other materials made to look like rice, and that was to bulk up the product, reduce the quality of it. And this brings me into looking at what the effects are of bid rigging, of procurement fraud in itself, because it has a very serious and negative effect for everyone in the economy. It distorts prices, it inflates costs, it can undermine the quality of service or product. The plastic rice issue is one example. It's damaging to other businesses who do not involve themselves in the practices. It's damaging to the economy of a country, it's damaging to the economy of the region. And it's harmful to every man and woman who are taxpayers. Because of the serious nature of the crime, punishments for those convicted are severe. When the crime is committed on behalf of a company, fines against the company can run into billions of dollars. And an example of this in a developed environment is that Airbus, the European and British manufacturer of the Airbus planes, was actually fined $3.6 billion. Sorry, it's 3.6 billion euros at one point. To put that into context of a local currency, a currency in the Caribbean, that's approximately 26 billion Trinidad and Tobago dollars. For individuals, the punishment is usually fines or time in jail or both. But the time in jail doesn't necessarily have to be in the country where the crime was actually seen. And the Piarco airport issue, which is headlining again in the papers of Trinidad and Tobago, is an example of where something committed in Trinidad and Tobago is being seen on the world stage. It's been seen in America, and it makes international news. We've noted that only individuals can engage in crime. So setting aside the occasions when the crime is perpetrated for the interests of a corporation or a company, and in those cases, the gain is primarily, but not exclusively, for the company. The rationale behind the crime is often that it's committed by individuals who are facing financial hardship or pressures. No, it's for personal gain, but it doesn't have to be monetary gain. And examples of a non-monetary gain are increased power, prestige, and sometimes even job security. I have seen examples where employees were being coerced to perform something which was immoral, if not illegal, purely, and the threat they were facing if they did not comply with those instructions was that they would lose their jobs, they would lose their security, it would be damaging for their family if they did not comply. Whatever the motivation is, the crime itself portrays a breakdown of mental and ethical barriers. The individual who commits the crime should be aware that he or she is doing something wrong, but they convince themselves of the value of their actions, the value to them or to their family of those actions. So how present is this risk? How present is the risk of procurement fraud or bid rigging? How widespread is it? Well, most of us, as we walk along the street every day, will not experience any incidents of bid rigging. But in the areas of government and corporate procurement, the risk of the practice is present all the time. The rewards to be made from government contracts are high. The arms industry is one which there have been films about it, there have been documentaries about it. So control mechanisms to try and avert the crime must always be active and up to date, because technology is bringing about different ways of committing these crimes. When we look at bid rigging in the procurement of government contracts, it's often the bidders who commit the crime, but it can be agents acting for the bidders, or indeed acting for the government procuring those projects. Now, bid rigging itself, as was indicated earlier, combines a number of different practices. There is bid suppression, holding back bids deliberately, complementary bids, and this is something I saw 30, 40 years ago in the UK when I started in the construction industry, where if a contractor wasn't particularly interested in bidding, it would go to one of the competitors and ask for what it was called a cover price. Now, the effect of taking that cover price would be that that particular contractor did not bid, but it gave an increased opportunity for the other contractors that were bidding at that point in time. And if there were only 3 bidding originally, it potentially became a 2-horse or even a 1-horse race. Excuse me. There are rotational bids as well. This is where the marketplace is relatively small and the principal players within the marketplace decide amongst themselves that they will take it in turns to be favored with a government project, that 3 of them will deliberately bid high to allow the 4th one a turn on the roundabout. There are phantom bids. That's putting in bids by companies which are unknown or companies which have very, very little history within the field. And I think that's been experienced in a number of the Caribbean countries over the last decade or so. So what is the cost of this? Well, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development estimates that the cost globally is 3 to 6% of the global gross domestic product per year. Now, there's always uncertainty when looking at statistics, but if we extrapolate those figures and look at 2 countries in the Caribbean and put that into a dollar value which might be felt as a consequence of procurement fraud and bid rigging, let's take Jamaica. In 2020, the gross domestic product, the GDP for Jamaica, was about $14 billion. Now, between 3 to 6% of that is somewhere between 400 to 800 million US dollars. That's a major impact on the economy. That's 400 to 800 million dollars of expenditure, which could have been avoided, should have been avoided. If we look at the economy of Trinidad and Tobago and make the same analysis, in 2020, Trinidad's GDP was about 21 billion US dollars. And the cost, 3% would be about 650 million. 6% would be 1.3 billion US dollars. Now, to put that into Trinidad's own currency, against a gross domestic product of $140 billion a year, and these figures are coming from the OECD, the possible cost to the country is between $4 and $9 billion a year. That's per year. Who finances this fraud? Well, most often it's the taxpayer. It comes from other government revenue. So it's the taxpayer, and it affects every person in the land, every man, woman who pays taxes. And if we look at Trinidad again and assume it has a population of about 1.4 million people, that additional tax burden, counting every head, every man, every woman, and every child, that means each individual is burdened with an additional expenditure of $6,000 a year, 6,000 TT dollars per year. Where the crime is in the private sector, for example, in the food industry, the effect is felt at the supermarkets. You pay it through increased prices. So you get the individuals are getting hit by this, not once, not twice, but multiple times. Now, I said earlier I would look at what the red flags are, and I've made a number of bullet points here. The ones which are most common are that organizations do not have, or they have very poor anti-fraud strategies. They also exhibit very weak risk management processes, and they do not have sufficient processes in place to investigate possible incidences of fraud. There are also slack controls on their people and on their suppliers. You might find that there is no whistleblowing policy, or that the organization, or indeed the country, is against the whistleblowing practice. There is poor accountability and governance, and both my co-panelists have spoken to that in the last few minutes. There is inadequate training. Education forms a big part of any practice, any process to try and control fraud, to control any crime. Another red flag is a lack of punishment for any wrongdoers, a lack of transparency. But when we look at individuals and the risk, what might show that an individual could be engaging in something illegal, you should look towards the stress levels within your staff. How are they behaving at work? What are they doing? But also look at other behavioral patterns. Are they spending excessively? Are they spending perhaps beyond what you consider is their ability, given the position that they hold and the salaries that they earn? Having looked at the red flags, I'd like to reiterate possible control measures, and some of these have already been spoken about by my colleagues today. First of all, there is a need to acknowledge the risk and to appoint a risk owner. Now, that applies whether you are a government seeking to prevent fraud and bid rigging, or whether you are a company. You should train your staff. There must be adequate training in place. Education is very important. There should be sufficient processes, checks, and balances in place. There should also be a limitation of permissions so that no one person is who has the opportunity by virtue of their permission, their position, and the positions that they are given. Tasks can be broken down, and those tasks can be isolated so that persons involved in the procurement process do not have control over the entire process and do not have control over elements of the process to which others have been charged with. Permissions should be controlled as well. I have seen in some countries permissions being limited to control the extent of expenditure that an individual is capable of making. That's okay, providing you then don't permit the same individual to use that permission on multiple occasions to give orders to the same supplier, effectively misusing the permission to continue with fraudulent practices. I've mentioned segregated duties. There is limitation on the individual's powers. And above all, there should be constant monitoring and updating of business practices for this. The incentives to commit the crime must be removed. Equally as importantly, the legal penalties should be enforced, and leadership should come from the top in any organization. Now, wanting more and wanting something better is always part of human nature, but there is a difference between needing more and wanting more. Need is quite often driven and well-meaning. Wanting is quite often, wanting is generally the area through which frauds are perpetrated. Neither should be grounds for committing a crime. I mentioned a moment ago that changes need to come from the top. Equally, those at the top should also be held to scrutiny and control. They should be capable of demonstrating that they are not active in any areas of corruption, and they do not accept that those practices exist. They should be against those practices. So in closing, I'd just like to give a roundup and say, what are the benefits that are going to be achieved by controlling the crime? And again, I'm quoting from the OECD when I say that government procurement tender prices can be seen to be reduced by as much as 20% if bid rigging is controlled. Other advantages are more competition is created. Better quality of service and product is usually found. There is a better standard of living for individuals in the economy. Taxes are better used. And there are even potentially better health benefits. And with that, I'd like to bring my presentation to a close. Thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Excellent. So we have now a good plan in place to start the conversations now between the panelists, right? I think we acknowledging that worldwide we have a problem, because that is who we are as human beings. Left alone in our respective areas, some of us would try to maximize our benefits without care for the other person. And this shows up in terms of the procurement fraud in different areas in all countries, in each country, right? Question is, especially now given to the private sector, right? Because a lot of talk about the public sector, right? And you see in all countries, things have been put in place, some more and others, some less than others. We heard from Mr. Ram that the Guyana seems to have some become gaps there. Trinidad is now trying to put things in place, right? And in some areas we have been successful, some areas we definitely have not been successful, right? And but the gaps are all around. What will it take now for us to move forward, right? What will it take for us to move forward? That is my question to the panelists.
That's, if I can lead on that, it takes a recognition of a problem at every person's level, and it takes a desire to move away from a criminal intent. No, it's only, I think it's only a small minority of persons within any society who operate and perpetrate frauds. And it needs an education, it needs strict governments, it needs regulation.
Yeah,
So provided that the impending storm allows me to speak. There's lots of rain on my side here and thunder. I've not seen the lightning as yet. But I think, again, especially within the Trinidad and Tobago environment, the proclamation of that legislation is essential, because I don't think that without the legislation that you can really and truly change the culture of corruption as easily as one would really like. Yes, so it means to say, one, making sure that there's proclamation, and then two, enforcement. Oftentimes we see the legislation, but then it is not being enforced. Another thing too is that sometimes you remember, it takes two, as the saying goes, it takes two to tango. Yes, so it's the person who is committing and the person who's benefiting. We must be able to trace where the money is going, where the fraud is being perpetrated, who are the perpetrators, but who's doing and who's receiving the benefit. Yes, and no one should be allowed to enjoy the spoils. So at this point in time, you're not seeing those things happening. But for us to really and truly curb the procurement fraud and as you said, that financial impact, everyone feels it in their pocket, apart from the perpetrators. Yes, the innocent really and truly pay for that crime at the end of the day. The social net gets smaller. So it means that we need to look at it from the perspective of every single person who is innocent of that crime must be able to understand how it impacts them, and also must be able to say, no, we are not allowing corruption. We are not allowing procurement fraud to continue. And those who are doing wrong must be penalized. But until those affirmative actions are taken and seem to be taken, I think the perpetrators benefit so largely. It's like, like human traffickers. Yes, so it is there, and it's becoming more and more extensive unless it is that you put in those measures in place.
So Ram, definitely think continue.
I have to say I'm pretty pessimistic at this point. I dealt with the private sector to start with, and essentially to say that there are little rules. Given the the pace at which Guyana is trying to develop, it is almost an inevitable consequence, particularly when you don't have the kinds of guardrails. Let me give you an example. You have, on our procurement legislation, you have a central authority, then you have regional authorities. And our countries are divided into 3 regions and then a whole set of sub-regions. Now, each of these places, we're a small country, less than 800,000 people. We're trying to run sometimes even before we can walk. And the number of cases you hear of nepotism and plain corruption, and you have that are treated more, oh, well, the Auditor General will address it in the Auditor General report, and the Public Accounts Committee will deal with it 3 years later. That's what we have. Unless, well, we don't have a procurement commission, we have a procurement, we haven't appointed our procurement commissioners or sworn them in as yet. And you ask the question, how can we deal with it? Well, you really need the will. And the question is there the will to deal with corruption, or is it seen, and many people do, unfortunately, see bid rigging, manipulating of the bid process, either sole sourcing or restrictive tendering or open tendering, whatever you want. And then it's manipulated by numbers 1, 2, and 3, just related entities wanting to give way to number 4. So I'm afraid, and I'm so glad that I have the opportunity to participate in this afternoon, because I think we really are, we in Guyana are not in a very good place when it comes to procurement and bid rigging and procurement fraud. As I said, it's under the criminal code, and which itself is so outdated. So I'm not optimistic that we can deal with this in the near term. Maybe law reform, which is taking place now, will, but I'm not particularly optimistic at all.
Understood. You know, again, making the point, you know, a lot of the focus has been in the public sector, but that's clear. A lot of players say they know that there is it's always two parts of the equation, and the focus always, you know, a lot of blame has been thrown on the government and the pipeline and so on. But who is trying to get the jobs, right? Even when you look at the Commission of Inquiry, look at the Dutch Commission of Inquiry, very good inquiry, lots of recommendation, but most of the recommendations, like the type of recommendations, is focused on the public sector. To what extent that the asking of the private sector, the respective areas, to stand up and say something, right? In Trinidad, I think it's only the contractors that are here talking sometimes, right? Chambers of Commerce, you know, what do they have to say? When I compare now, there's a recent commission inquiry in South Africa, the Zondo Commission inquiry, all right? That came out, first part came out in February. And they took a slightly different approach. It might get a chance to read, right? Be part of it. The report stresses that a number of problems are inherent in the area of public procurement, including a high degree of dependence on procurement on the persons that have political and military power and scant involvement in the private sector in the drafting of laws regulating the area. So they directed some of the attention to the private sector, let them know that they have a responsibility there too, right? To what extent is the Law Association, is the Chambers of Commerce, the ICATs, to what extent are we using our voices in our respective professional organizations in order to make a change from a private sector, so that can have a proper, you know, conscience, you know, both have a proper conscience, but influence it by impacting upon that space, that economic space.
And Don, may I also join you in that question, because I think that point is well made. And when we hear what Chris Ram has had to say in terms of what happens in Guyana, it is very clear that there need to be a huge culture shift, a huge mindset change, but as Claire is saying, the benefits to engaging in procurement fraud are so great that the threat of being found out is really not so bad, especially because there's not sufficient enforcement. Now, if we try to understand, so then how did other countries deal with this issue? Because as John said, it happens everywhere. It's not just here in the Caribbean, this is happening everywhere. So the real question for us is, even as we are getting the procurement legislation done here in Trinidad and Tobago, the real issue is, and Chris spoke to this too, when you have a small society where everybody knows everybody else, it is so easy for those relationships to allow for persons to engage in underhand behavior to support each other in order that they could benefit and benefit in really tremendous ways. So what are some of the things that we can do to help begin to have that mindset change and that culture shift?
That's an interesting question. It goes to the heart of it. I agree with everything that's been said in relation to this being a crime which is perpetrated and which is extremely difficult to address. I think I made a comment during my presentation that other countries have put legislation in place and they are fighting it. They haven't eradicated it. It's still there. Even in the UK, it is still there. And I don't think we ever will get rid of it, because human nature is tainted with greed. We all want to create a better life, create a better position for us. All we can do is put in place things to control this. And as you've said, it is pointless having legislation in place if that legislation is not enforced. And if you're in a society where it takes 20 years to bring a case to court, there is no risk for those who perpetrate it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But I also want to point to, apart from those very big cases, what happens here, and so Chris, this is to let you know, we struggle to in Trinidad and Tobago with this. What happens here a lot is you find procurement fraud occurring even in small areas. A company is going to have a sports day. You're going to purchase t-shirts for everybody in that organization. The person who is on the planning team may now engage, in their own system of fraud to get a cut from whoever they award the contract to, from the printers for the t-shirt, and it's a number of persons now who are engaged in this. Just as Claire said at the start, it's not one person. It takes two to tango. Sometimes it's several persons being aware.
If I can just interject with an anecdote there, I've even seen it with wedding planners. Wedding planners will only recommend people that they get a cut from.
Yes. So how do we begin to tackle that as a cultural change that needs to happen?
I think understanding the various types of fraud, because bid rigging is just one type of fraud. Yes. So like, for instance, if it is the directors and officers don't take time to understand their organization, a simple thing like this, yes, you can have procurement taking place where someone is purchasing items that has nothing to do with the company's operations. And even though those items are coming in, being received by the organization, They just find themselves in a dark room and they remain there. But somebody is being paid for that order. Yes, but the company has never benefited, and that's where that value for money comes in. You know, and then on top of that, a year or two after, yeah, or maybe even 5 years afterwards, there's something that is called surplus material, you know, or obsolete items. Yeah, or all of a sudden there are some things there that nobody seems to know what in heaven's name they are for. And then the company makes a decision, okay, dispose of them. And then you say, okay, you're disposing maybe at 25% of the cost. Yes. And guess who buys it back? The same company that might have supplied you, you know? So it's simple things like that. And sometimes those who wanted to do right, if it is that they have that extent of knowledge so that they can see the red flags of fraud, what fraud looks like, what is it? Yes, and then now building those controls, those measures, so that you can say, well, okay, everything that's coming, it must pertain to the company's business. Yes, so if it is that we are going to pay for it, yeah, yes, there may be a valid order, because sometimes that's all the financial officers might be looking for. They might be saying, okay, there's a valid order and there is a valid receipt, yeah, because receive note, yes, there's a valid invoice, it appears, right? But then failure to understanding, does it pertain to the company's business, right? And to what use is it going to be applied? Who, and that is why too, they put in your controls upfront, which is your strategic procurement plan. Yeah, what is it that you're planning to procure and why it is that you're going to procure? How much is it? What does it look like when it reaches you? You know, so understanding the needs of the organization is fundamental. So that from the time that you know that extra money is being spent or extra items are coming into the organization, surplus goods are being purchased, yes, even dealing with poor quality work, you know, even saying that, okay, there's a repeat, who's paying for that? So the type of wrongdoing and fraudulent actions that take place within procurement, it's mind-boggling. It's mind-boggling. So I think that directors and officers understanding what fraud looks like is also very important. But my first presentation was, you know, getting them to understand, okay, we don't want you to be a fraud expert, but you must have reasonable information, you know, so that you must be able to know when it looks like fraud, when it is that you start suspecting, so that you can now ask the right questions. So it's the willingness of those who are placed as stewards of the organization. Yes, that's protecting the assets of the organization, and their willingness to ensure that the right things are being done in all aspects of the operation.
Well, that point was raised yesterday when you talked about directors to understand their business, and for in terms of their role now, it's to understand whether they have good fraud prevention processes in place to assist them in addressing the risk, right? Open the floor up now to our attendees. Are there any questions from our attendees?
Yes, there is one, Don. So if we could invite Margaret and DePisa, if she will unmute and ask her question. In fact, she has a very strong comment in the chat. So Margaret, are you able to unmute?
Yes.
Right, good. So we look forward to your contribution there. Go ahead.
So I agree with what everybody on the panel has been discussing. And I look at it from a holistic approach. Even from the start, fraud is a given. Those things happen all the time. But the important thing is you as a company recognizing that these things are happening, to put controls in place to mitigate some of those issues. And you have to do it in a 360 approach. You cannot just say, identify bid rigging and try to swipe for bid rigging. Bid rigging is as a result of a lot of activities that are not happening in your organization. And therefore you have to put controls, as was mentioned before, even permission to have certain levels of approvals. You have to put controls as it how to treat with your customer, your user, because they can go out, look for vendors, have their own arrangement with vendors, and then come to you if you don't have proper procedures in place and proper processes and policies in place, and they will come to you and tell you, buy this specific thing. So they can manipulate the process by giving you a brand and a specific product type and tell you this is what you want. And if you are not doing proper procurement, as Claire would have mentioned, strategic management, strategic procurement and so on, you would be very lazy and say, the user came to me and telling me to buy this specific thing, so I'm going to buy that. But guess what? It's only one person have that specific thing. So competitive bidding going on doing it, because even if you give the appearance of competitive bidding, you will end up when you're doing evaluation to give it to this one person because they met all the criteria that was set up before it even came to you. So when I'm talking about holistic, is to look at how we qualify our vendors to be part of the process, so that we will, when we realize this vendor is the same vendor using the same insurance company, and it's about three companies he has. So you call, where you talk about a phantom vendor. He is the same person, but he coming under 3 different names. And therefore, if you don't pay attention to that, you can miss it when you're doing your pre-qual, because you have to be able to do proper due diligence when you're pre-qualifying a vendor to be part of the process. And likewise, when you are involved in the procurement of an item from the beginning of the project and not at the end. So some of our challenges is we are not involved in the process at the beginning. So the user, the engineer, those kind of get involved, meet with the contract with the vendors, come up with their own material product, and then come to you at the end to procure. Wherein if you were involved at the beginning, you will be part of the process to be able to identify those kind of issues. In dealing with the board and management, they too, that's another part where you have to put controls, because a board member could have somebody that they want to give a contract to, and you are not aware, and you get instructions to deal with certain things. But if you have proper policies in place, and that's why the act is coming in there, you will be able to say, we cannot do this because the policy doesn't say that, or the policy says this is it. So you better put some controls between you and the board, or between you and management. So when I said a 360 approach, I am thinking is not just looking at it from one position, but you have to identify your procurement process and move from the transactional type of procurement and start identifying different ways of how we can do more efficient procurement practices.
Mm-hmm.
There is definitely a need for a full risk analysis in any procurement. And
Correct.
we should remember also that there are 2 parties involved. If we're looking at government procurement, we should be looking at the risks of the fraud occurring within the government employees as well as within the private sector as well. The problem with fraud is it is such a hard thing to tackle that it's too easy for people to ignore and think it will go away.
So I find that Chris is looking a little bit despairing. What can we say to him that's going to help say how we will deal with this problem when, you know, it's such a deep-rooted issue? So my thinking is, from what we have discussed, first we identify the fact that there are those who are likely to be involved, and thankfully it's usually not the whole population. It's a small group of persons who will engage in wrongdoing, but then highlight the impact of that on other persons to show, you know, that it's not a blameless victimless type situation, but, you know, it has a direct impact on quality of lives and how the people are able to grow. Anybody tell me, what can we tell Chris Ram that we can help say that we are going to, you don't need it to be an absolute law, or does it have to come to that? Do we have to have legislation in order that we can change these practices to bring it in line with fairness, transparency, and good governance? All right, it's a difficult one. Let me put
We don't
another
want to
place
we
there.
don't want to cheer
So
up, Chris.
auditors now, auditors have this responsibility to say when you're doing audit of the firm, to also look for material weaknesses. Now, what follows? Is it that there is now a responsibility to disclose that in some way, that everyone becomes aware and there's an impact on the reputation of the firm, and then that now begins to turn around?
That's become a big issue in construction, particularly with the collapse of the international giant Carillion a few years ago. And now they're looking at it and saying, were their auditors to blame? Were their auditors' practices, even though they were within the parameters of good practice for the accounting and auditing industry, were they under an extended duty to warn of the risks associated with this?
Because sometimes the auditors and all other fraudulent ones are contributing to the fraud, you see? Because if there's a serious conflict of interest there, which means to say that they know that they're not supposed to be providing that level of independent audit, if it is they're providing accounting services already, or some of their key personnel already in the organization, because sometimes they're even competing with the internal auditors function. Sometimes they're making negative statement about the internal audit function, and primarily so that they themselves can go back and get the business process improvement and risk management and governance advisory services, yeah, which is in the realm of internal auditing, you know. So so corruption even takes place there. So how do you deal with that that level of corruption, that when it's supposed to be coming from the uncorruptible persons? Yes. So you still have to put in your preventative measures, so that when it is that you engage a firm, you know exactly what the service that they're providing, and then you don't allow them to overstep the boundaries, so that they can now compete with the provision of either accounting or taxation services or internal auditing services, you know, even advisory services. So it is in all, I think procurement fraud is in all organizations, in all sphere, you know. Once you're procured, once the money is passing, yeah, there is a way of benefiting from it to the detriment of the organization. And that's reality.
Yeah, I think you're sorry, Chris, go ahead.
I must come in here as a practicing auditor. That's a rather wide brush we're hearing. Auditors do operate under some fairly strict rules. Auditors also, as we saw with Enron and the whole bunch of those companies, auditors are too tolerant and too mindful sometimes of the fees they get. Following after the issues with those companies, you had Sarbanes-Oxley in the UK, in the US. Professional firms have also, the professions, the accounting profession, certainly strengthened its code of ethics. Now, you have a place like, I recall Trinidad and Tobago. This is not to be critical of Trinidad and Tobago. They no longer require audits in relation to non-public companies. Mm-hmm. Now, I think that is overly generous. In Guyana, we still do. And I think, you know, clear, and you would expect me for this defending accounting profession as well. There are probably more cases of auditors resigning an appointment because they could not persuade management to behave in a responsible manner than cases where auditors have violated their code of ethics and trust.
I totally agree with you, Chris. The point I was making is that one should not be blinded by whichever profession or what type of services being procured. I was speaking to the fact that fraud can take place in any type of procurement transaction, even in the procurement of audit services, where it is that you expect to get incorruptible services. So that was the point I was making. But I do agree that yes, it's in the minority, you know, and of course I will defend but I'm an internal auditing profession, not the external auditing. Yeah, so I've seen it from all my years of experience. I've seen it coming from all sphere, and that is why I would want to see that everyone has to be mindful that once $1 is being paid, it does not matter to whom. There is someone there who may just be sitting there trying to see how they can get an extra penny out of that $1, fraudulently so. Yes, so that was my message.
We're dealing here with an issue which is millennia old. From the days of Adam and Eve in the garden, we've learned that no one is incorruptible. So it's an uphill battle all the time. From my experience with auditors, I haven't found any auditors who I would say I have found to be corrupt. What I have found is that due to commercial pressures and pressures from boards of directors to put forward reports which are favorable to shareholders, to be able to give shareholders increased dividends or even consistent dividends, to persuade the shareholders to keep their investment in those organizations, then some auditors can be persuaded to stretch the limits of credibility from time to time.
I do have experience with some very, what should I say, factual experience, but I will rest my case.
All right, so
yes, I don't want to horrify the participants or my poor brother auditor, you know. So I'll rest my case.
Well, we go down into the end here. I will sum it up by saying that we are looking to see that we have seen it happen from two levels, from two perspectives. At the micro level, in terms of the private organization, the companies, and on the macro level, the impact that fraud has upon society at large, and to the extent that those extra bodies can play towards removing it. So now I will give the opportunity for each panelist to say something after. What can be done, right? Just sum up their thoughts on the matter and to provide some guidance on how we can go forward.
John, you're not starting first, or you want to end?
No, I was going to let you go first this time, Claire. I don't want to get a reputation for liking the sound of my own voice.
Well, all right. Well, I will not take that reputation either. But nonetheless, you know, as we said before, fraud will be there. I believe that once there's an opportunity, there's a motive, yeah, it will occur. Human nature is as such. Greed, I don't think we can ever get rid of greed, but we ought to be able to prevent it from occurring within our organization as far as possible. And as directors and officers of the company, it is our duty to protect the assets of the organization. It's a duty to comply with the legislation that governs the organization. So as such, we must, as directors and officers of our organization, ensure that we understand fraud, what it looks like, as John says, all the red flags of fraud, and then take measures, proactive measures to address it. You may not be able to eliminate all incidents, but you ought to be able to, one, demonstrate zero tolerance for it, and two, that you're prepared to prosecute that matter as far as possible. And that is what I would like to leave with the participants. Thank you.
The conversation is about corporate governance. It's clear that there's a lot of work to be done in relation to the procurement and the risk of fraud arising out of procurement in the private sector, whether mainly in public companies, obviously in government companies. State audit agencies have got to pay particular attention to bid rigging and procurement fraud. Internal auditors who are there in an entity day in, day out also have a major duty. Auditors come in, external auditors come in, they do samples, they don't necessarily see the whole picture. But if we can put overall controls, I think we can make some progress. Clearly, we need legislation, we need education. We need to take this just outside of the normal criminal code and address procurement fraud for what it is. And it's really a major cost. As John was saying, all the studies in whichever country you go, corruption probably, and it comes a lot with procurement, in some places, it starts at 10%. So just think about it. We have a serious problem we're dealing with. Thank you very much.
For my closing comment, I would like to say, if none of us do anything, nothing will change. It's incumbent on each and every one of us who has corporate responsibility, government responsibility, to look at this seriously, bring to attention things which are wrong, assess those risks, make those changes. At least at night, if every one of us does that, at least at night we will go to bed with a clear head and a clear heart.
Said.
Agreed with that, Claire?
Well said, well said.
Thank you.
I just want to, very good point. You know, and taking that into consideration, there's one individual from India who decided to do something, and he set up a website. I paid a bribe, and he invites persons who have had experiences of paying bribes, mind you, which I found very strange, to confess or to say that they have been attempts at the bribe. And that website right now has a number of hits on it. You can Google it and see. And that was one individual who tried to make an impact upon his society. So I agree with John, all right? And each of us can do what we can, all right? My takeaway on that is, you know, the Caribbean Corporate Governance Institute has an important role to play, and to see how we can influence the direction upon the chambers of commerce and the other professional bodies, so that we can have an effective conscience on the boards to not tackle this particular area. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Don, and thank you, Claire, Chris, and John for very, very interesting conversations. And also thank you to our participants who also put some additional comments in the chat. We have Osha Hayward, who said she agreed with Margaret's earlier comments, and the policies, strategies must be properly policed and sanctions applied to the transgressors. And Margaret followed up with another comment start by identifying these bid rigging as risks and put measures in place in the register. And then we have Joanne Salazar adding that as directors and officers, in addition to all the legislation, regulation, policies, and procedures, culture is the key, and the tone has to be set from the top. Obvious, but often overlooked. thank you all very much for your additional input. This area of fraud, of course, is something that really is very important for us to address. And Don, I love how you ended that. I wasn't aware of this website in India where this person went on and said, well, I paid a bribe, and invited everyone else too, so that they can see how many persons are contributing to this poor culture that they have. If in Trinidad and Tobago, we were to start such a thing for persons to say who paid a bribe to get their driver's permit, I think that should raise the level of awareness for us to understand that seems to be more the norm, you know, than actually going through the process as it's supposed to. And once we engage in these kinds of practices, you know, it's like, you know, the little things that you overlook, thinking that you want to catch the big fraud, but it's the little things that makes a huge difference as well, and condones this kind of behavior, and also allows for the big ones to happen. Now, my major concern with this area is our procurement regulation in looking to cure this problem has arrived at what is a very interesting solution. It says that the chief procurement officer is the person who is going to be held responsible and accountable. Now, in as much as the regulation has taken responsibility away from the boardroom, we understand from all of the conversations we've had today that relationships among people does muddy the entire playing field, and that sometimes boards can still influence the chief procurement officer, whether it is through benefits or whether it's through coercion. Do we now leave that chief procurement officer to stand this all by themselves? Because facing jail time is a very powerful deterrent. But as we saw with our fair trading commissioners earlier, you know, you don't want to go in that direction first. So we have to ensure that we fix our practices, because none of us would want to leave our chief procurement officers to be the ones to be the scapegoats, right? So there's a lot of work for us to do, but as the panel indicated at the end, each of us could make a difference by starting in these fixing these practices. So thank you all so much for your input.